Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you to all of you for coming. The questions that I've got in front of me, I am actually going to start with what does the term paganism describe, because I think that is going to set the scene perhaps a little bit for what we're going to talk about. So when people say paganism, there are all sorts of things that sort of come into their heads. And a lot of them have to do with witches and cauldrons, and often a conflation with Satanism, which I know causes a lot of anxiety. And, you know, this is a little bit of a scary, not very nice thing. The first thing I want to say, I think, is that while there is a legitimate satanic tradition, paganism has nothing to do with it. It is a completely different set of traditions. I think the second thing that I really want to say is that it is really much more accurate, and within religious studies it's actually more common to talk about paganisms rather than paganism, because a bit like Hinduism in some ways, it's an umbrella term that covers a wide variety of religious traditions. A lot of pagans would actually reject the term religion or religious, because to them it is connected with ideas of dogma and hierarchy and being told what they ought to believe, which tends to go against pagan sensibilities quite a lot. Personally, I do use the word religion. This is something I feel quite strongly about. I think the rejection of religion is largely because of the ways that people have tended to define religion, which have come from 19th century anthropological definitions of religion that all have to do with belief in supernatural beings and ethical systems and this sort of thing. I tend to be much more in tune with scholars such as Graham Harvey and Douglas Ezzy, who describe religion much more in terms of an embodied thing that is about making meaning, and is about, Ezzy in particular describes religion as a set of resources for living a life endowed with soul, by which he means meaning, connection. And he talks about the key aspects in religion being community, story, and ritual. And that is far more in tune with how I feel about religion. And if you define religion in that way, then to me, paganisms absolutely are religious traditions. There are many different pagan religious traditions. I can only speak with any authority about Britain. Probably the largest single group is Wicca or witchcraft. Then it's Druids, with heathenry now coming up very closely in the rear. All of these are quite different in a lot of ways, and they have different histories. What they probably have in common is a concern with nature as a way of connecting with the divine in whatever way they understand the divine. They have ideas of connection, relationship. They draw inspiration from the past, I would say, is the key thing. And this is probably the biggest single thing that separates pagan from New Age traditions. New Age traditions are very often focused more on the future, whereas paganisms tend to draw their inspiration from a pre-Christian past. Another myth, I think, about paganism is that pagans believe that they have an unbroken line of tradition back to the pre-Christian past of the British Isles. Most pagans don't believe that. You will, you know, that, as you all know, with your connection with RE, it's never right to say all pagans this or anybody that. Most pagans do not now believe that there is any sort of unbroken tradition. Paganism is a new religion. It's a new set of religions. It goes back, I would say Druidry, which is my own tradition, I'm a Druid, has the longest history in Britain, and I would say its roots can be traced back about 300 years. And then there's a big explosion of interesting things happening with Druidry about 200 years ago. However, Druids will tell you that they take inspiration from the Iron Age Druids, certainly from the Greek descriptions of the Iron Age Druids, which describe them as sort of wise counselors, people who undergo a 20-year education in natural philosophy, astrology, people who act as counselors to kings and stop wars. This is the image of the Druid that modern Druids are taking as inspirational, rather than the, you know, sacrifice people if you look at them wrong sort of view of Druids. I think there is a quotation actually that I'm going to read to you from Ronald Hutton, which to me, you know, if you want to say what is paganism, this sums it up really nicely. This was for an interview that he did with Pagan Dawn magazine in 2016, and he described paganisms as a set of traditions calling on ancient images and ideas, but addressing some of the greatest needs of modernity, and in doing so drawing on major streams of British culture going back over 200 years and a continuous tradition of ceremonial magic going back millennia. And the last phrase was because he had traced ceremonial elements from Egypt into Arabia, into Hermeticism, and through Hermeticism into British occultism, and through British occultism into modern paganism. Paganisms as they are now, particularly Wicca, which is probably the best known, I would say has its roots probably from about the 1850s onwards. There was as you all know, a huge growth in the Romantic poets, the Romantic movement, that started to move away from the idea that the divine is to be found in organized religion and in church services, and more towards the idea that the divine is better encountered through nature. And that idea drew in a lot of literary connections with Hellenistic religion, with the ancient Greeks, and with Pan in particular. And Pan as a deity became a hugely influential figure at the turn of the century in a lot of writing. And that influenced Wiccan ideas of the horned god, which are not the devil. So in Wicca, you have very much the idea of, Wiccans very often tend to talk in terms of a god and a goddess. Some Wiccans understand that as actual god and goddess. For some, they are just personifications of the dualities of nature. But it's very much rooted in the idea of nature. And this is one of the things that makes paganisms a very apt religion to be studying at the present time, but I'll come on to that when we get on to that question, but it does fit very well. People very often say to me, what do pagans believe? This is absolutely, totally the wrong question. Because, as I will tell you until you go to sleep, if you will give me the chance, religion is not about belief. I believe that very firmly. At least religion is not exclusively or primarily about belief. I think this is something we have inherited from post-Enlightenment Protestant Christianity, which is closer to being about belief than any other form of religion anywhere in the world. But religion generally is far more about what people do and what people feel than it is about what people believe, I think. And paganism does not have a scripture. It does not have a hierarchy. It does not have a set of dogmatic beliefs or teachings. In terms of ethics, most pagans that I know are effectively situational ethicists. What it does have is this way of orientating oneself towards the world, which is what suits it so well to this idea of worldview studies, because that is exactly what paganism is. It's a way of orientating yourself towards the world and towards the other persons in the world. But in terms of how it relates to things like deity, there are many, many, many different beliefs. There are pagans that are complete atheists. There are pagans that are monotheistic. There are pagans who are dual believers, who it's not uncommon, for example, to find Druids who are also Buddhists or Christians or Jews. because there is nothing hugely dogmatic within paganism, it doesn't necessarily exclude any particular worldview. So it's not a case that you cannot simultaneously believe that Jesus was the Son of God and be a Druid. So, you know, there is that huge flexibility. Duotheism, this idea that there is a god and a goddess, is common in paganism. I would say it is 20 years ago. A guy called Andy Lecture did a PhD on Druid belief, and at the time that he was working, duotheism was the most common belief within Druidry, within paganism, wider than that, I would say. Now, my research, it's no longer the most common belief. There has been a rise over the last 15 years. Interestingly, there's been a rise in hard polytheism. So polytheism, as you know, is the belief that there are many gods. Within paganism, there is a spectrum of hard polytheism to soft polytheism. Hard polytheists believe that the gods have independent existence from us and from each other. They are real, genuine entities that you can form relationships with, that you can, usually reciprocal relationships. So when pagans enter into relationships with gods, it's often in the form of taking vows in exchange for something. Soft polytheism is more the idea that the gods and goddesses are ideas. So they may be used in ritual. People might have gods on their altars, but rather than believing that they exist as separate entities, they may see them as an anthropomorphic representation of the force of nature. So Tyrannus, for example, to represent thunder and the sort of raw and untamed power of nature, or as aspects of personality. So that by engaging with God, you're effectively doing work on your own personality. And every sort of strain of belief in between exists within paganism. Something that has become much more overt, again, I would say in the last 15 years within paganisms, is animism. And not as Edward Tyler defined it, as the belief that everything has a soul or a spirit, you know, that there is a spirit of this particular stone. Graham Harvey has written a great deal recently on what he calls the new animism, and he is very clear that he does not mean this is a new belief. What he means is that this is a new understanding of the old belief because we got it wrong the first time. When you know, people were doing anthropology in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century, and they were talking to animistic people who had an animistic worldview, they completely misunderstood it. And they misunderstood it because they were coming at it with a Christian set of tools for understanding the world and understanding what the soul is and understanding what spirit means and all this sort of thing. And he suggests that it's not so much to do with spirits, it's to do with personhood. So to an animist, you relate to other things in the world as if they were persons. And this can, of course, be other human beings. It can also be the animals that are in your ecosystem. It can be the plants that are in your ecosystem. It can be a river. It can be a mountain. It can be a tree. It can be an ancestral spirit. It can be a god. It can be the spirit of a local place. But the important thing is that it is a person. And Harvey writes a lot about other than human persons. It's a term that originally came from Hallowell. And again, when we get on to talking about worldview, that's something I want to say quite a bit about, because if you orientate yourself in that way towards the world, it changes quite magically, the way that you relate to things. So that, I suppose, is a very whistle-stop tour of what is paganism, which is something I could talk about for a whole day quite easily. So rather than me just keep on, does anybody have any questions about any of that?
Just do feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. You can also make comments. It's not just about questions. If you want to sort of note anything with Jenny that you find particularly interesting. I was interested in the hard paganism being quite so transactional, Jenny.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is quite a difference, I suppose, from a monotheistic tradition or a sort of Abrahamic conception of God. And some pagans do have a sort of mixed view, if you know what I mean, that the gods exist, but there is an ultimate reality or an ultimate source that is beyond that. And that is also quite a common view. But that is not usually conceived of as being a personality. So there's a lot of panpsychism. So sort of the idea of whatever the universe fundamentally is made of is conscious. So everything is consciousness. Is not an uncommon view. And within that multiplicity of consciousnesses that constitute a universe that is conscious, one of the things that can exist is gods. And for pagans that have that particular view, and again, this is drawing on old sources, because if you look into accounts of people dealing with gods in old mythology, it very often is transactional. And, you know, if you ask for something, you promise something in return. And, you know, we find this in Britain a lot in the Roman period, where somebody will make an offering at a shrine, and we only see it occurring in the Roman period because they wrote stuff down, basically. Yeah. So you can actually see the inscriptions that, you know, in return for being healed, so-and-so has made this donation to this shrine, and this sort of thing. And this is quite a common way of interacting with gods. And I think the key idea is that gods are not, the gods as a sort of plural thing are not seen as sort of supreme ultimate beings. They are different to humans. They behave differently to humans. They have different sets of abilities. But they also have their own agenda. So, for example, you know, a deity might seek out a pagan whose agenda is similar to theirs and effectively say, do you want to work with me?
I've heard that description of the word inspiration.
Yes.
That when you're inspired, you're actually breathing in a spirit of something that's wandering around, which is really interesting.
Yes, and certainly can be seen like that. I mean, sort of, if I were using my profession as a funeral director as an example, there are obviously gods that are psychopomps, that are guardians of the dead. And they are the sort of ones that might say, okay, you know, you are putting yourself in service to the dead and the bereaved. Let's work together on that. Or as an academic, if I was using myself as an academic, then again, there are gods that are connected with wisdom, with communication, with understanding, with learning. They're the ones that might hook up with an academic, you know, so it's not just a case of, you know, I want money, so I'll pray to the god of wealth. It's a case of, I want to achieve this that will make the world a better place. Who are the best deities to work with to achieve that? And likewise, for a lot of pagans, they will think, you know, there are deities thinking, I want to make the world better in this way. Who are the best people that will help me to achieve that? So it is very much a two-way thing.
I don't know if it's Lucia or Lucia. I'm hoping it's Lucia. I'm not sure. Lucia's asking specific questions about resources in relation to teaching paganism, which we might come back to you later, but I won't lose them, Lucia. I will keep those for the last section on that question. Can I ask a really blunt question, Jenny, before we carry on? How do you know what pagans believe? You're speaking with great authority. It's a massive diverse group. How do you know?
I don't obviously know what all pagans believe. By any means.
I know, yeah, but generally speaking.
Partially from, I mean, my PhD research is fairly specific. It's about modern druids and the ritualization of death. But as a part of that, I did put out a survey, and I got lots of responses from that, over 600 responses from that, not all of whom were druids, and it covered quite a range of things. I spend a lot of time talking to pagans, obviously. I'm the education officer for the Pagan Federation. And therefore, you know, one thing that pagans love to do, you will find, is talk. Pagans are great discussers. And again, you know, just in books, you know, there are plenty of people doing research on, you know, the pagan view of this, the pagan view of that, the pagan view of the other people's PhDs, of which I've read a great deal recently.
I guess one of the questions we might come across later, and for the information of everyone in the room, the Resources Centre, which is hosting this event, I will send out a link for you all to the recording, providing Jenny's happy for it to go out, because our speaker always gets authorization to go no. And I will also send out some links that Jenny's mentioning. But I think one of the questions is about validity. So you've mentioned different pagan gods. If you're going to research pagan gods on the internet, or if you wanted to know who's a really good authority on paganism, there must be some work around validation of that, or at least quality control. That's true for resources on most traditions. You might come back to that later, but I'm just picking it up.
Okay, I think in terms of knowing what gods are connected to what, yes, there's a lot of information out there. I mean, I cannot actually remember a time I wasn't interested in religion. I think I sort of came into the world interested in religion. Whether that says anything about reincarnation or not, I wouldn't like to comment, but I always have been, and I have been reading mythology of one type or another for as long as I've been able to read. And that's where I've picked up a lot of my information about individual gods and goddesses. There is the issue. I said that there's no scripture, there's no hierarchy, there's no sort of church authority. Different traditions do this differently. Probably the closest is Wicca, because Wicca is an initiatory tradition. So you don't just decide you're going to be a Wiccan. Certainly not in the main Alexandrian and Gardnerian traditions. You have to find a coven, you have to be accepted into a coven, and you have to undergo a period of apprenticeship before you're initiated into the first degree. And during that period, to an extent, there is your quality control, because there is a priest and a priestess, usually in a coven, who will tell you what they consider to be good sources, good authoritative sources, and what they don't. There's much less rigidity in other forms of paganism. Not all witches are Wiccans. There's traditional witchcraft, there's many types of witchcraft. Within Druidry, there are a number of different Druid orders. Now, whilst they're to some extent initiatory, and a lot of them have sort of correspondence courses that take you through the degrees, they're not as closed and hierarchical as Wicca can be. But they do have a lot of discussion groups. So there are many, many Facebook groups, both connected to the orders and otherwise. And you will quite often find somebody saying, look, what's a really good book on X? Or what's a really good introductory book about Druidry? And that will open up a really good, conversation. Sometimes there'll be lists of books on the group, and there'll be discussion, actually don't go anywhere near this one, it's rubbish. So, there is that sort of self-regulation, I suppose, that goes on.
Good evening. I love the lecture. I welcomed this topic, and I'm very fond of this not only paganism but different. It's the native religion. But I would like to ask you: did you have a chance to meet people from Germany, from France? Because I had a chance to have friends who were Druids, and I didn't have a chance at the time to explore more. But did you have a conversation with them? Something you can highlight, the differences, the similarities?
I haven't met many. There's the last time I was with a big gathering of Druids was last summer at the Obod Summer Gathering in Glastonbury, and there are always some that come from other countries, and it's always fascinating to talk to them. But I haven't spent a lot of time doing it. What I would say is a really good source for that. Larissa White has very recently brought out a book called World Druidry, and it is based on a survey that she undertook. Now, my survey, or at least the data set that I'm currently working with, is all of British Druids. That's not the only data I've got. I've actually got data from a much wider range than that, including a lot of American Druids and a lot of European Druids. But she specifically set out to get a data set from Druids from all over the world, which is exactly what she did. She actually had her survey translated into a number of different languages, which I didn't. And her book is absolutely fascinating as an analysis of how Druidry differs between different countries. So that is well worth looking out for that one. Okay, so what might a pagan worldview look like? And this, I'm guessing, is where a lot of you are interested from an educational perspective. And I'm kind of going to merge this a little bit with the, is it appropriate to use the word magic in this context? Because to me, a pagan worldview is a magical worldview, or perhaps a better way of putting that is that it's an enchanted worldview. Because if you want to look at a specific contrast with, for example, the Abrahamic religions, and this is something that Graham Harvey specifically said, again, another book, I think it's edited by Denise Cush, I believe, and it's called Celebrating Planet Earth. And it's an account of a conference that took place, I think, in 2017. It was around then, between certain pagans and certain Christians that had this very sort of nature-based approach to spirituality. And some of the leaders from both traditions met for a conference, and this book is sort of the proceedings of the conference, and it's fabulous and it's fascinating. But Graham Harvey wrote the introduction, and one of the things that he said is that if you're looking for a key term that defines Christianity, then that key term is salvation. What is it? Essentially, at its heart, it's about salvation. And if you want to look for a comparable term within paganism, what at its very heart, at its very core, what is it about? Then that word is re-enchantment. And that, I think, is at the heart of what a pagan worldview looks like. So I mentioned that Harvey also talks a lot about other than human persons. And it's kind of about connectivity, it's about relationality, it's about reciprocity, and it's about viewing things that Western society doesn't traditionally see as being endowed with personhood as persons. And this is very much an animistic worldview. And so if, for example, if you take the example of a river flowing through a town, if you see that as something that carries trade goods, if you see that as a commodity because you're using the water from it, you're using it to carry sewerage, you're using it to do this, you're using it to do that, you're using it to do the other, the word is using. If you change your perspective and you see that river as a person, then suddenly your whole attitude to it changes. And it's not about what can it do for me, it's about how does it fit into my world and how does that work better. And I know that I believe in the Amazon, I may be wrong, but somewhere there is a river that has been given the status of a person under law. And this changes. It doesn't mean that you think you can go out for tea with it. It doesn't mean that you think you can sit down and have a conversation with it in the same way that you would have a conversation with another human being. It does mean that it has rights, that it intrinsically of itself has rights. And that really does change the way that you relate to it and to think about it and how you think about an ecosystem. And in terms of that worldview, I have another quote for you. This is a young scholar, Jonathan Woolley, whose PhD is actually, he is a Druid, but his PhD is actually in ecology rather than anything to do with religion. And he presented a paper to OBOD in 2017. And this is what to him is at the, and again, it's Druidry because that's my tradition, that's where I'm most comfortable talking from. I think a lot of this applies to paganism more widely. So he says, Druidry is a form of re-enchantment, an attempt to restore some of the magic and meaning stripped from the land through the alienating forces of capitalism and consumerism. The basic work of the Druid is to spin this process into reverse, to challenge the relentless commodification and alienation from our world. And it does so through a very specific aesthetic, the aesthetic of enchantment. And that, I think, is actually a pretty good description of, you know, the ground that a pagan is standing on when they look at the world. And from that point of view, is it appropriate to talk about magic? It really depends what you think magic means. And magic is one of those words like religion, soul, God, where you can be having a conversation with somebody and you're using exactly the same vocabulary and you're talking about completely different things. And you're talking at complete cross purposes. And it's, you know, they sometimes say that England and America are two countries separated by a common language. I think the same is very true in religion, that very often we're separated by a common language because we're all quite certain that we know what these words mean until we try and use them with other people, and then we discover that we don't quite know what they mean. And I think magic, I have read so many papers about, you know, what does magic mean? I think, first of all, the thing to say about it in a pagan context is that it does not mean doing miracles. So it does not mean, you know, I can hold my hand out and a flame would appear on it. It'd be really cool if it did now, wouldn't it? Terrify me. It doesn't mean I can do that. It doesn't mean that you can make something fly from one side of the room to the other. That's not what pagans are talking about when they talk about magic. The other thing to say is that it is not anti-scientific. And you very often hear people, particularly what I would call extreme atheists, contrasting a magical worldview with a scientific worldview, generally speaking to the detriment of the magical worldview. They will say, you know, the scientific worldview, that is modern, it's provable, it's demonstrable, it's good, it leads to progress. The magical worldview is superstitious, it keeps us stuck in the past. A magical worldview, certainly from where I'm coming from, isn't one that is denying of science. It doesn't mean that if I get cancer, I'm going to take herbs and chant a spell rather than going to see a doctor. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is a way of looking at the world and continuing to say, wow. It's a way of looking at the world and seeing it as interconnected, as seeing it as, and I think this is possibly the crucial thing, seeing it as alive. And seeing it as endowed with its own form of consciousness. So do pagans do spells? Some of them do, quite a lot of them do. I would say that is quite common in Wicca. It's quite common in witchcraft. It's less common in Druidry. Ceremonial magicians certainly work magic. And for them, the idea is often through correspondences to bring the world into alignment with their will, which really in intention is not very different to what most religious people are doing when they pray. Other pagans would actually reject that view of magic as trying to manipulate or change the world. For some, it might actually be trying to put themselves in alignment with the world's purpose. And so, for example, something that I hear a lot when people are talking about magic is that they discover what they're supposed to be doing, and all of a sudden things start falling into place to make that possible. You know, to facilitate that and to keep that going. A lot of pagans would understand that as magic. But this idea of magic as enchantment, magic as the world isn't dead, it's not a commodity, it's not something to be objectified and used, it's something that's alive, that is vital, and that is mysterious, I suppose, that is not capable of being fully understood. And that synchronicity, connection, all of these things can work together to create a world that is not mundane and that has surprises and can act in ways that don't appear to be purely cause and effect in the way that we understand it. So, you know, it's not levitating things. It's not walking through doors. For some pagans, it can be changing reality. It can be bringing about things that you want through ritual, through ceremony, through correspondences. very often. So this is where plant law, this is where astrology can come in. But really, it's about this way, it's about a worldview. It's about a way of looking at the world and seeing it as something that is fundamentally alive and exciting and active and something that you can interact and form a relationship with. And so when I talk about a magical worldview, that's what I'm talking about. And to me, that makes it well worth studying, because it's a very different place to stand to look at the world from where a lot of religions do. So I think that's what I want to say about worldview and magic, but I am very open to questions on that.
I was going to ask about the nature of things, the aliveness. Is the aliveness between things in the world a common aliveness, do you think, or are things different by nature? Does that make sense?
I think you will get many different answers asking pagans that. And I think for a lot of pagans, it's not so much a cognitive philosophical problem as it is an experience of the world as being alive. And so I know a lot of people that will go and talk to trees. And that is, it's very easy to then get an impression of somebody that goes and chats to a tree and expects it to talk back. And that's not quite what is meant. It's again, it's forming a connection and very often trying to experience the world. Obviously, you can't experience the world as a tree, but you can imagine what it's like to experience the world as a tree. And perhaps you can make a connection with a tree. And again, then somebody cutting down a tree becomes a very different thing. You know, it's not something to do lightly. It's not that you should never cut a tree down, but it's not something that you do lightly, and it's not something you do for fun, and it's always sad when it happens. I think that's kind of what I mean by connection. I think it's an aliveness. I think it's a vitality that people experience and open themselves up to. And I think also, absolutely, I believe, and I realize this is a very controversial thing to say, because the word magic has a bad rep in some areas, and certainly it's seen in some places as being, you know, dangerous and occult and connected with things that are bad. But I would say very strongly that all religious traditions have a magical element in them. And the other thing that it's about, of course, the other thing that fundamentally at its core magic is about is transformation. And if you look at sort of the old alchemists, you know, they were always about transmuting, transforming, you know, base metals into gold and what have you. Magic is about, usually it's about transforming yourself into something else, but it is always about transformation. But again, you know, I will come back to this fundamental idea of paganism being about re-enchantment rather than transcendence. So in a lot of Abrahamic traditions, and actually in the Dharmic traditions to some extent, it's about transcendence. It's about overcoming and moving away from the material world and from the body into some higher world. Whereas paganism tends very much to be focused on transforming your relationship in this world rather than trying to transcend it.
Yeah, right at the beginning of this second section, and I kind of didn't, because I was so transfixed in what you were saying, I then I kind of forgot the beginning bit about where you were saying about the world having rights, and I can't remember what it was very early in what you said. And did you talk about a river, I think?
Yes, and I'm not prepared here because I can't tell you which one or where it is, but I do know that as a part of, and I think Graham Harvey might be the person to ask here because I think I heard it from him, that there is a river somewhere, I think in South America, that has been recognized as a person under law.
That was it, yes.
Which means that, you know, any decision that is made with regard to it has to be made with an eye to its own welfare rather than the welfare of the people around it.
Yes, that was it. Oh yeah, right. Okay.
So what about the competing? Obviously, one of the things that all traditions come across is when they have respect for and they value other created things. There's a collision because people have to eat and people have to do stuff. I mean, is there anything about a pagan worldview that has commonalities around diet? Or, I mean, obviously not over all of them, but I'm just wondering if you sense a trend as you did in the last 15 years.
Okay, so as I said, there is no guiding set of ethics. Graham Harvey would say, I'm saying that a lot, aren't I? He is definitely somebody to read. Graham Harvey would say that all religion has its deepest roots in an attempt to negotiate the conflicting needs of different persons, and some of whom need to eat others of whom. So he has a marvelous book called Sex, Death and Strangers. No, it's not. It's called Sex, Food and Strangers. It's a different one I'm thinking of. It's called Sex, Food and Strangers, which to him is the essence of what religion is about. It's about how you negotiate relationships around sex, food and strangers. And food involves relationships with persons that you might need to eat, whether they be animal or plant. And that a lot of indigenous peoples in particular have rituals for dealing with this in a way that allows them to meet their needs, but also allows them to be respectful. As I said, the majority of pagans that I know, and this will not be universal, but the majority of them, if you were asked them how they make ethical decisions, what it would effectively comes down to is situation ethics. And also this idea that there isn't a rule set. You cannot possibly have a rule set because the world is far, far, far too complicated for that. And certainly there is no idea of divine law. There is, I don't think anywhere in paganism is there an idea that something is right because a god said it is right. Even if a god says do this, there is always the, actually, is that a good idea? Do I want to do that? Does this fit with my own honor and ethics code? And if it doesn't, then I won't do it, even if a god's told me to do it. But there is honor, is huge. Personal honor is hugely important, I think, in most types of paganism. And the idea that you don't react to a situation, what you do is you shape yourself. So again, this idea of transformation, that if I act repeatedly in a way that makes me into a certain type of person, then faced with an ethical decision, I will make a good decision. It may not be that every pagan makes the same decision, and it may not be that there is a great decision that it's possible to make, but I will make a decision that is honorable and in line with my ethics and as good as can be made for that situation. And I think that that is probably the approach that the majority of pagans would take towards ethics, that it's about personal honor, personal responsibility, relationship and reciprocity, and making yourself into the sort of person that makes good moral decisions. Okay, so the last question I've got here is, why might paganism be a valid, useful addition to the RE worldview curriculum? Well, I'm hoping that I don't have to justify valid. It is a religious tradition with as much validity as any other. Why would it be a particularly useful addition? I think there's a number of reasons. Firstly, because at the moment it's growing, and it's growing very fast. I've got some census data. Where did I put the census data? Okay, so from the latest census, the total number of people on the census reporting some form of pagan orientated religion was 108,050. That is going to be a huge underestimate because not everybody fills in that question, and pagans are notoriously stubborn and difficult when it comes to that sort of thing. But it's huge. And I know there's been quite a lot reported in the press recently that shamanism was the single biggest growing tradition in the census data, there was the biggest growth there to any other, which is interesting because shamanism isn't actually a religion. It's a practice that is employed in quite a lot of different religious traditions around the world.
Jenny, well, we've got you in the room and you're an expert. Can you just tell us more about why you're distinguishing shamanism in that way? Because I haven't got a clue why that would be different.
Okay, so a shaman is a specific role. It's a specific, I mean, for a start, it's a hugely controversial word. It's it's one of those really difficult words. And the reason it is so controversial is because it comes from a very particular time and place. And it has been applied across the world, you know, and to a lot of people, there's a lot of appropriation going on around the term shaman and shamanism. I would tend to use the word shamanism or shamanistic practice with a small s. And at its heart, it describes the practice of projecting your spirit out of the body for a specific purpose. And that purpose is usually certainly traditionally in indigenous communities that practice shamanism, it is generally speaking to serve the community. People are chosen to be shamans. They don't generally choose it for themselves. And the process of becoming a shaman in traditional societies is extremely unpleasant and effectively usually involves some sort of experience of being dismembered or taken apart and put together again. And the idea is that you can travel between the different worlds, you can travel in the spirit worlds, you can use those connections, you can use the connections with spirit to heal people, both mentally and physically. You can help people to retrieve parts of their soul that are missing, because this idea that you have one indivisible soul, that you're comprised of a body and a soul, that is also actually a very Christian idea. And it's not universal. There are many, many other ways of understanding what makes a human person in the world. So that effectively is what shamanism is. So it's a practice rather than a religion. It involves a particular worldview, and the worldview is that there are spirits and that it is possible to communicate with them using a set of tools and a set of practices that enable you to do that usually have to do with mind altering, sometimes through trance, through dance, through drumming, in some societies through the use of psychotropic drugs, but in some way of altering your level of consciousness in a way that allows you to do that. And that's why I say it's not a religion, because it's like saying that priesthood is a religion, or, you know, cantor is a religion. It's a role within religion, and it stretches across different religions.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
There's a lot of us, is one thing, and it's growing. I mean, the Pagan Federation have just had their sort of annual meeting, and apparently membership has gone through the roof. I don't have figures on that yet, but it has totally gone through the roof recently. And one of the reasons that I suspect that that is the case is because it is a religion that is very much in tune with the zeitgeist. I'm thinking here particularly in terms of ecological awareness and, you know, the green movement and green campaigning. You know, I know that at an awful lot of the fracking demonstrations, for example, there was a Druid circle, which is not to say that everybody that was there was pagan, but there were certainly a lot of pagans there. And I suspect this is where some people are actually encountering paganism for the first time. So it's very much in keeping with the feel of the times in terms of that, in terms of ecology, in terms of the attitude to nature. I think also in terms of personal responsibility for, you know, learning. Nobody else is going to tell you that something is wrong. You decide that for yourself. Nobody is going to tell you you have to do this, you have to believe that, you have to wear this. Those are things that you come to, you know, independently for yourself. So again, I think that is very much in keeping with how modern society is working at the moment. You know, that's something that appeals to people and that they feel that they want to engage with. Another good reason for teaching it, I think, is because it is a really good contrast to the Abrahamic worldview. So the Abrahamic worldview puts you in one place, looking at the world in a very particular way. And the pagan worldview puts you in a different place, looking at the world in a very different way. And that, I think, is always helpful in education, generally, to allow people to look at things from very different perspectives. And also, you know, within an English, within a British setting, it's a tradition that is very much grounded in sort of British self-awareness in the British landscape. I have heard so many pagans say to me that they started in Christianity and they felt that they couldn't really relate to it. They didn't have a huge problem or falling out with it. They just felt that they couldn't relate to it because the stories that it was telling were set in a different landscape with different climate and different animals and things that they just didn't recognize. Whereas if you look at the stories that certainly Druidry takes a lot of its inspiration from the Mabinogi, which is a set of medieval Welsh stories. They are very much rooted in the British landscape. You know, you're hearing stories about blackbirds and starlings and oak trees and things that we encounter. And therefore it's a spirituality that is very much set here. And, you know, from that reason, and I feel very strongly that every child that is educated in Britain should know the British stories, regardless of their religion, their ethnicity, totally irrelevant. They should know the British stories, just as they should know the Bible stories. Of course they should. Absolutely they should. They should know the stories from, you know, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Absolutely they should. And they should know the stories that come from Britain. And paganism is a really good platform to teach those from.
I love that. This is how I can plug our Resource Centre Northern Saints book, because no one will publish it, so we did it ourselves. But you're absolutely right. I think those stories are missing. Can I bring Tim in? Because I think Tim's got a really interesting point.
Hey, Jenny, I made my apologies and got ready to go, and then you've been too interesting. You've ruined everything.
Sorry.
Anyway, I just thinking about the less positive sides of religious traditions, I guess, and the more critical lenses that we might want to bring in as well.
Sure.
It seems to me that one reason why paganism should be taught in schools is because when you encounter paganism in the news, it's often attached to the far right.
Absolutely.
And that kind of thing. And I wondered if you could comment on that, which is in some ways kind of is the dark side of what you were just saying, I think, a little bit. But for some people, you could say, well, paganism is ours and it's the true British tradition before all those nasty foreigners came over here.
Yeah, totally.
And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it is absolutely the flip side of that. Yeah, that might have been a bad thing to ask me. This could take a while. There is that level in it. I've written in my doctorate, I've written quite a lot. It wasn't intended to be quite a lot. This happens to me a great deal. It was intended to be a couple of paragraphs and then it got its own life and flew off, about whether Druidry in Britain is indigenous religion or not. And obviously the term indigenous is another one of these terms that is hugely loaded because it comes with this baggage of, you know, as you say, far right, white supremacy, we are the true people and all the rest of it. And my conclusion was that modern Druids are not indigenous people, but the religion can be seen as indigenous or indigenizing. And indigenous religion is a different thing to indigenous people. And it took about 7,000 words, so I'm not going to do that here. But one of the things that pagans have to be very careful with if they are going to use words like indigenous or indigeneity is the baggage that comes with that and the accusations that come with that, which I have to say I have not encountered in paganism, but that is probably because, like everybody else, I move in a bubble, and the bubble that I move in is very liberal and open and non-homophobic, non-misogynistic, non-racist. but there is the possibility for it to be perverted in this way. And I think the tradition that has the hardest time with this probably is heathenry. Heathenry is a pagan tradition that is rooted in the Norse, Viking, Anglo-Saxon traditions. It comes closer than any other type of paganism to having scripture, because it has the Eddas, which were written by Christian monks in the 13th century, but they do tell stories about pagans. And I think because there's this macho white image of Vikings that has tended to be subverted a little bit, and you see symbols like the Odin's knot being used by fascist groups as a symbol. The person to look out on this is a guy called Andy Pardee, who is a heathen. He is the founder of the Pagan Police Federation. So he is a serving officer in the Met Police, and what they do, what the Police Pagan Federation do, they do two things. Firstly, they're a resource for pagans. So if, for example, I'm taking my grove out into a forest tonight and we're going to do a ritual, I tell my local contact, this is who we are, this is where we are, this is what we're doing. And then when somebody rings them and says they're sacrificing babies in the woods, they can say, no, they're not. We know exactly who they are. We know what they're doing. This is nothing bad. And the other thing they do is they educate other people about pagans and about what paganism is and what it shouldn't be. And I know Andy, I think today, has submitted his master's dissertation in the appropriation of pagan symbolism by the far right. So he is absolutely the person to speak to about this. But yes, the short answer, it's a problem. And it means that we have to be very careful about the language that we use and the impression that we create. And I think generally speaking, most pagan communities are extremely good at policing themselves on this. There is very low tolerance for any language that is leaning in that direction. And people tend to get ejected from groups with not very much ceremony when they start talking in these ways. Of course, the problem is that they then find each other and go and make their own groups. So, you know, yeah, I think the short answer is yes, it's a problem. It's probably not a huge problem. It's a bigger problem in America than it is in Britain. But it's the people that are doing this are a very tiny minority.
Yes, certainly. I think it's it's another reason for teaching the subject, because it's a way into such interesting and important things that need to be discussed.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, I mean,
because, you know, this is the one tradition that has some mysterious problems, but it's a really important way into like how people think about religion in the modern world and all sorts of other big questions.
Yes, absolutely. Totally agree. And I was part of the Resilience project that the Religious Education Centre ran a number of years ago. I was one of their school advisors for that project. And that was basically about not shying away from the hard questions in religion, in all religions. And I think that is so important, because if all we're doing is showing the sort of the fluffy bunny side of religion, then, you know, we're selling ourselves short, and we're taking away from our children that ability to do the critical thinking and to say, yeah, actually, this is good and this is bad. And actually, you know, there is no religion that is wholly good. You know, religions have difficult questions in them, and some people have quite bad answers to those questions. So yeah, that is absolutely a reason to be teaching it.
I had no idea that there was that kind of appropriation. All the work I've done is in around appropriation of Christian stuff. So that's really mind-blowing. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And of course, the other I mean, we were having this conversation not very long ago. A few of us that saying within the Pagan Federation, saying that the problem we have a huge problem with the media. And this is one of the reasons why I think my work with the Religion Media Centre is so important. But if we appear in the media, it tends to be in one of two ways. And one of those ways is poking fun. You know, look at these weird hippie people out doing these funny things. Isn't it highly amusing? And the other one is they're dangerous. You know, every time, you know, there'll be animal mutilation somewhere, and suddenly it'll be witches that are doing it. Or, you know, there's accusations of really weird sexual practices, because pagans, you know, sex as a topic does not tend to be a central moral concern within paganism. It's much more a case of people take responsibility for their actions and they behave with honor. And anything else is none of anybody else's business, which tends to lead to accusations of, weird sexual practices. And that's all that the media are interested in. And so, yeah, we do have a problematic relationship with the media, but the problem is that presenting the truth about paganism, which is that there are pagan teachers, there are pagan lecturers, there are pagan judges, there are pagan lawyers, is actually quite boring as far as the press are concerned. So to try and get them to engage with that is quite tricky.
So tell us about resources, Pagan Federation website, what's available, how teachers can resource themselves to do this well.
Right, work in progress, I'm afraid. I know that a number of years ago, Mike Steigel, who at the time was the president of the Pagan Federation, wrote a fabulous scheme of work for paganism, which I am still trying to track down and get up on the Pagan Federation website, but we are working on that and we will. I am doing a very, very bad job at the moment as the education officer because I've got a few other things going on. However, hopefully, at least at the end of June, one of those will go away and I'll be more on the ball. But the intention is to have schemes of work up on the Pagan Federation website that people can access. I am given to understand, I haven't actually gone and looked at it myself, I'm afraid, but I am given to understand that RE Online has got some resources on paganism. That should be very useful, but watch this space basically. And there is stuff, there are certainly guides to the different pagan traditions that are available on the Pagan Federation website. And one of the things that will go out with the mailing that Carenza is going to send out will be my Pagan Federation email address. So if there's a specific question or something that you need to ask, then you can drop me a line there. You see, this is the other thing, we get disinformation within paganism. So the question I get asked so many times is, why don't you teach, why isn't paganism in RE? Why isn't it in agreed syllabuses? Why isn't it that? Why don't they have to teach it? Of course, you know the answers to all of that, and there's nothing stopping any teacher from teaching it. The reason that it is specifically mentioned in Cornwall's locally agreed syllabus is because it is, I think there are the highest proportion of pagans in the population in Cornwall compared to anywhere else in England. And so it was, I think the in Cornwall, which is really odd, the proportions of religion go Christian, Buddhist, pagan, whereas that is not the case in most of the country. And therefore they felt they really had to engage with it as something that, and also of course they have so many ancient sites which, whilst they weren't built by Druids and there is no direct line, they are used as places of worship by modern pagans. So there were all those connections in there as well. There is nothing to stop any locally agreed syllabus having an appendix or an agreed, an additional bit as a resource for teachers on paganism if they want to have it.
Right. My love to all of you for being here. Thank you so much. We all know that without teachers in the room, nothing would happen. My thanks to Jenny for her unbelievable expertise. I don't know how many books you cited there without showing off. Yes, I'll get all those links in. Don't you worry. Everything that's in the chat, I will download and get off to you. There you go, Rebecca, that's not a problem. I'll get it all off to you so you get it all sorted. My huge grateful thanks to Jenny, whose learning is just worn so lightly for the benefit of so many. And I'm really delighted you could join us, Jenny. Thank you so much.